Power isn't the only thing that hides in plain sight. So does pricing. And once you start looking closely, you realize something uncomfortable. A significant portion of what people spend money on isn't about function at all. It's about perception. Two outfits placed side by side can serve the exact same purpose, covering your body, keeping you comfortable, lasting a reasonable amount of time, and yet one costs 10 times more than the other. Two cars can get you from point A to point B with similar safety ratings, similar fuel efficiency, and similar reliability, yet one carries a price tag that feels almost irrational. The difference isn't engineering. It isn't materials. It isn't even durable in many cases. The difference is the logo, and that difference, what you pay beyond the actual value of the product, has a name, even if no one calls it out directly. It's the logo tax. The logo tax is not listed on a receipt. It doesn't show up as a line item, but it's there, embedded in the price, quietly inflating the cost of anything that carries status. It's the premium you pay not for what something does, but for what it signals. And the reason it works so effectively is because it taps into something deeply human, the need to be seen, to be validated, to belong, or sometimes to stand out. Brands understand this better than most people realize. They don't just sell products. They sell identity. They sell aspiration. They sell a version of you that you can wear, drive, or display. If you strip away the branding, the numbers become much clearer. A plain white t-shirt might cost a fraction of what a designer version does, even if both are made from similar cotton, manufactured in similar factories, and designed to perform the same basic function. The markup isn't about the shirt, it's about the meaning attached to it. The same applies to sneakers, watches, handbags, and even everyday items like sunglasses. In many cases, the difference between a mid-tier product and a luxury branded one is not proportional to the price gap. The gap exists because of perception. This is where the idea of the status premium comes in, which acts as a mirror image of something more commonly discussed, the poverty premium. The poverty premium refers to the extra cost that lower-income individuals often face, like higher interest rates, fees, or the need to buy cheaper items that wear out faster and require frequent replacement. It's a penalty for having less. The status premium, on the other hand, is a voluntary surcharge paid by those who want to signal more. It's not imposed, it's chosen, but that doesn't make it any less real. What makes the logo tax particularly powerful is how invisible it feels. People don't usually think, I'm paying extra to impress others. Instead, the decision is framed in terms of quality, lifestyle, or personal taste. And to be fair, branding can sometimes correlate with quality, but the correlation is not always consistent and it's often exaggerated. There are plenty of mid-tier or even generic products that offer equal or better performance at a fraction of the cost. The challenge is that choosing those options requires stepping outside the narrative that brands have carefully constructed. That narrative is reinforced constantly, especially in the age of social media. Platforms are filled with curated images of lifestyles that emphasize aesthetics, luxury, and status. You don't just see a pair of shoes, you see what those shoes represent. You don't just see a car, you see the life that supposedly comes with it. Over time, this creates a subtle pressure to align your purchases with the image you want to project. It's not always conscious. In fact, it rarely is, but it shapes behavior in ways that are incredibly consistent. And here's where the math becomes impossible to ignore, because the logo tax is not just a one-time cost, it's a pattern. It repeats across categories: clothing, electronics, accessories, even experiences. If you consistently choose the higher-priced, logo-heavy option, the extra amount you're paying compounds over time. Not in the financial sense of earning returns, but in the sense of cumulative outflow. Hundreds become thousands, thousands become tens of thousands, and that's where the real impact shows up, not in any single purchase, but in the aggregate. Now flip that perspective. Instead of paying the logo tax, imagine redirecting that same money into something that grows rather than depreciates. Investments, for example. Even modest, consistent contributions can compound significantly over a 10 or 20-year period. The difference between spending an extra $200 on branded items every month versus investing that $200 is not just incremental, it's exponential. Over time, that gap widens into something substantial. It becomes the difference between financial stress and financial flexibility, between working by necessity and working by choice. This is not about eliminating all branded purchases or rejecting quality. It's about awareness. It's about understanding what you're actually paying for and making intentional decisions rather than automatic ones. Because once you see the logo tax for what it is, it becomes harder to justify in the same way. You start asking different questions. Is this price reflecting real value, or is it reflecting perceived value? Would I still buy this if the logo were removed? What am I actually getting for the extra money? And this is where the concept of stealth wealth starts to make sense. Stealth wealth is not about deprivation or extreme frugality. It's about choosing to allocate resources in a way that prioritizes long-term stability over short-term signaling. It's about opting for products that deliver quality without unnecessary branding, neutral designs, understated aesthetics, items that perform well without announcing themselves. The goal is not to appear poor, it's to avoid paying for appearances altogether. Interestingly, this approach often leads to a different kind of confidence. When your financial decisions are not driven by external validation, you gain a level of independence that is difficult to replicate through consumption. You're no longer chasing an image, you're building a foundation. And that shift, while subtle, changes how you interact with money on a fundamental level. There's also a practical advantage to this mindset. When you focus on function over branding, you naturally become more discerning. You research more, you compare options, you look for durability, versatility, and value. This doesn't just save money, it often leads to better purchases overall. You end up with items that last longer, serve multiple purposes, and integrate more seamlessly into your life. The absence of a logo doesn't mean the absence of quality. In many cases, it means the opposite. At the same time, it's important to acknowledge that the logo tax is not purely irrational. Social signaling has always been a part of human behavior. From clothing to possessions to experiences, people have used visible markers to communicate status, belonging, or identity. The difference today is the scale and speed at which these signals are amplified. Social media compresses distance and time, exposing individuals to a constant stream of comparisons. What used to be local is now global, and that intensifies the pressure. But pressure does not equal necessity. And that's the distinction that matters. You don't have to participate in every trend. You don't have to match every standard. The logo tax only exists if you choose to pay it. And while that choice is influenced by many factors, it is still a choice. Another layer to consider is how branding affects perception beyond the individual. In professional or social settings, certain brands can create assumptions about competence, success, or taste. This is where the line between strategy and excess becomes blurred. There are situations where presentation matters, and investing in quality can have tangible benefits. The key is to separate intentional investment from habitual overspending. One is strategic, the other is reactive. Over time, the cumulative effect of avoiding unnecessary logo tax becomes increasingly visible, not in what you wear or drive, but in what you have. Savings, investments, options, the ability to handle unexpected expenses without panic, the ability to make decisions based on preference rather than pressure. These are forms of wealth that don't rely on visibility, but they have a far greater impact on your life. And perhaps that's the most important takeaway. The logo tax is not just a financial concept, it's a psychological one. It reflects how much value you place on external validation versus internal stability. It reveals the trade-offs you're willing to make between appearance and substance, and once you become aware of it, you start to see it everywhere. Not just in your own choices, but in the broader patterns of consumption around you. Because at the end of the day, the question isn't whether brands have value. Some do. The question is how much of that value is real and how much of it is perception. And more importantly, how much you're willing to pay for that perception over time. Because the cost isn't just the price tag, it's the opportunity you give up every time you choose the logo over the leverage. And that cost, unlike the logo, is very real. And once you begin to really internalize that idea, another pattern starts to emerge. One that is even more subtle but far more powerful over time. And that is how the logo tax quietly reshapes your baseline expectations without you realizing it. Because it doesn't just affect what you buy, it affects what you think things should cost. After repeated exposure to premium branding, inflated pricing starts to feel normal. A $300 pair of shoes stops feeling excessive. A $1,000 phone upgrade feels routine. A $5 coffee becomes part of daily life rather than an occasional expense. The danger isn't just the spending itself, it's the recalibration of what your brain considers reasonable. This recalibration is where the real long-term damage happens, because it locks you into a higher-cost lifestyle that becomes increasingly difficult to step away from. Once your standards shift upward, going back to more affordable options can feel like a downgrade, even if the functional difference is minimal, and that's exactly how the cycle sustains itself. Brands don't just sell you a product once, they reshape your expectations so that you keep coming back at higher price points across multiple categories over many years. There's also a compounding social effect that reinforces this behavior. When your environment, friends, colleagues, social circles operates within the same inflated baseline, it creates a feedback loop. Everyone's spending validates everyone else's spending. A branded purchase doesn't feel excessive if it matches what others around you are doing. In fact, it can feel necessary just to maintain parity. This is where the logo tax stops being an individual choice and starts becoming a group dynamic. And breaking out of that dynamic requires a level of awareness that most people never consciously develop. But here's where things get interesting. When you step outside that loop, even slightly, you start to see how fragile it actually is. You realize that much of the perceived value of branded items depends on collective agreement. If fewer people buy into the signal weakens. The logo only means something because people collectively decide that it does. And once you question that assumption, the entire structure becomes easier to navigate on your own terms. This is also where the idea of delayed signaling becomes relevant. Instead of using purchases to signal status in the present, you redirect those resources toward building actual financial strength that can create options in the future. It's a shift from visible, immediate validation to invisible, long-term leverage. And while that trade-off may feel less rewarding in the short term, it compounds into something far more powerful over time. Because real financial security doesn't need to be displayed. It reveals itself through freedom. Freedom of time, freedom of choice, freedom from pressure. Another layer that often goes unnoticed is how the logo tax interacts with lifestyle inflation. As income increases, spending tends to increase alongside it. But when that increase is driven by branding and status rather than actual need or utility, the gap between income and savings doesn't widen. It stays the same, or sometimes even shrinks. This is why people can earn significantly more money over time and still feel financially constrained. The extra income is absorbed by higher cost versions of the same categories: better clothes, newer devices, more expensive experiences, all carrying their own version of the logo tax. And this is where the contrast becomes stark. Two individuals with similar incomes can end up in completely different financial positions based on how they handle this dynamic. One consistently pays the status premium across multiple areas of life. The other selectively avoids it, choosing value-driven alternatives where possible. Over a decade or two, the difference between those approaches becomes enormous, not because of drastic sacrifices, but because of consistent small decisions that either preserve or erode financial capacity. It's also worth noting that the logo tax doesn't just apply to physical products. It extends into services, experiences, and even digital spaces. Premium memberships, exclusive events, branded collaborations, these all carry elements of perceived status that can inflate pricing beyond functional value. The same principles apply. You're not just paying for access or utility, you're paying for association. And while that association can have value in certain contexts, it's important to recognize when it's being leveraged primarily as a pricing mechanism. At the same time, completely rejecting all forms of branding isn't necessarily the goal. The more effective approach is selective awareness. There are situations where brand reputation aligns with quality, reliability, or long-term value. In those cases, paying a premium can be justified. The key difference is intentionality. You're not paying for the logo itself. You're paying for what the brand consistently delivers. That distinction is subtle, but it changes how you evaluate every purchase. This is where developing a personal framework becomes useful. Instead of reacting to marketing or social pressure, you establish your own criteria for value. Durability, cost per use, versatility, resale value. These factors shift the focus away from branding and toward measurable outcomes. And once you start thinking this way, the logo tax becomes easier to identify and avoid because it rarely aligns with these criteria. There's also a psychological shift that happens when you stop relying on external markers for validation. Your sense of worth becomes less tied to what you display and more tied to what you build. This doesn't happen overnight, but over time it creates a different relationship with money, one that is less reactive and more strategic. You're no longer spending to keep up. You're allocating to move forward. And that brings the conversation back to the core question. How much are we paying just to impress people? Not in a judgmental sense, but in a measurable one. Because once you quantify the difference, once you see how much of your spending is driven by perception rather than function, you gain the ability to make different choices. More intentional ones, more aligned ones, because the logo tax isn't enforced, it's accepted, and that means it can also be declined, not all at once, not perfectly, but gradually, consistently, in ways that compound over time. And when you do that, something shifts. You stop buying signals, and you start building substance. And that difference, while invisible at first, becomes unmistakable over time.